to History Class with Dr. W. and our continuing discussion of 1968. In our previous lecture, we began talking a bit about the background of the Vietnam War that will lead us very soon to a discussion of the Tet Offensive, which took place in January 1968. At the conclusion of the last lecture, we made it to the end of the Kennedy presidency and also the end of the Diem regime in South Vietnam. In this lecture, we'll pick up the story with the Johnson presidency, which will lead us directly to the factors that contribute to the Tet Offensive of 1968. In previous lectures, I talked at some length about President Lyndon Johnson, who of course is the president as we begin our year of 1968. He's an intriguing and in many ways unfortunate figure. We talked about some of his changes on the home front, his policies under the Great Society, but it's also important to note that he was consumed with the Vietnam War. He listened to his advisors, he listened to the public, and all the feedback that he got early in his presidency pointed to escalation of the war. So he increased American involvement dramatically, and ultimately the domestic reforms he cared so much about were lost as the nation became consumed with the conflict in Vietnam. He took office with the highest of hopes and the most ambitious reform agenda. He left it saddled with this legacy. As one historian has written, he was the only president to lose two wars, the war on poverty and the Vietnam War. If Johnson could have won the Vietnam War, surely he would have gone down as one of our stronger presidents. So he took up Kennedy's program of limited involvement and stepped it up considerably. His thought was that he might be able to resolve this conflict by bombing the Vietnamese into submission, and thereby avoiding a long ground war in Vietnam. He began bombing the supply line that the Viet Cong was using, which ran through Laos, which was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this was the lifeline, the supply line running from North Vietnam to the south that would be troublesome throughout the entire war. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is a very important element of the war, and particularly in 1968. It began as essentially a narrow footpath running through the jungles, a trail, as it were. The Viet Minh began to build up this trail so that trucks and large vehicles could make use of it. This was the supply line that kept the South going. At its height, some 20,000 men each month moved from North Vietnam to South along this trail. Lyndon Johnson also sent ships to the Gulf of Tonkin to offer support for covert South Vietnamese activity. In August of 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin, North Vietnamese troops attacked two American destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy. There was great uncertainty as to the nature of these attacks, and even what the Maddox and Turner Joy were doing in those waters in the first place. But Lyndon Johnson called it an unprovoked attack and sought support from Congress to retaliate. According to the Johnson administration, there were two clear attacks, but the second took place under extremely bad weather, and sources agree now that the second attack never happened. There was confusion on board the ship, and the ship's equipment and radar were blinking out in the bad weather. There are still many questions about the nature of these attacks. Lyndon Johnson and others who approached Congress and in Congress didn't really clarify the many questions about these attacks and simply sought the authority to retaliate. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution ultimately passed Congress 416-0 in the House and 88-2 in the Senate. This resolution gave the President the authority to take all necessary actions to protect American soldiers. It was essentially a blank check to stop the aggression. This becomes very important in the context of 1968 because, in essence, all of these members of Congress, 416 in the House and 88 in the Senate, without realizing it in that moment, had granted their support for what became the war in Vietnam. So when we get to the 1968 presidential election, and many Americans are looking for an anti war candidate to support. You won't find them in Congress because almost everyone in Congress had voted to support the war with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Johnson determined to use the authority and resources provided by the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to step up and escalate the American war in Vietnam. In February 1965, the Viet Cong bombed an airfield in Pleiku. In response, Johnson stepped up the bombing, which was now known as Operation Rolling Thunder. It was strategic bombing, controlled. We bombed transportation and supply lines. Lyndon Johnson didn't want to bomb too close to the Soviets or too close to China at this point. The hope was that the bombing would break the morale of the North Vietnamese. So there were three broad goals of these bombings: to cut off supply lines from north and south, at the same time cutting off troops moving from north to south, and also to break the morale of the North. But bombing alone will not win this war. The ground troops were shrouded by trees, and so it was very difficult to successfully hit the trail or cut off the troops. And at the end, the results of the bombing may have hindered the supply lines from time to time, but never broke them. The numbers of troops moving from north to south continued to escalate, from 3,000 a month to 4,000 a month to 20,000 a month, as I mentioned, in January 1968. And they never succeeded in breaking the morale of the North, perhaps even strengthening their resolve through the course of these bombings. One outcome of these bombings is that they necessitated growing numbers of troops on the ground in Vietnam to protect and defend the growing number of airfields used for the bombings. The general in charge of American troops in Vietnam, William Westmoreland, repeatedly asked for more ground troops. And while they were controversial, and while Lyndon Johnson did have some reservations, in April of 1965, he ultimately authorized the sending of 20,000 American combat troops to Vietnam. This was the beginning of the true ground war in Vietnam for the United States. And those numbers of troops continued to escalate from 1965 to 1969. In 1965, peaking at 184,000, 1966, 389,000, 1967, 463,000, 1968, 495,000, and 1969, 541,000. And we'll be talking very shortly about the Tet Offensive and one of the outcomes of that, which ultimately will be to pull back on the number of ground troops. It is at this point that the United States enters a true ground war in Vietnam, and over the next several years, from 1965 to 67, they fought a seemingly hopeless and deepening war that many scholars have referred to as the abyss in the mid-1960s, this just sort of hopeless and never-ending war. There were many challenges and problems with the United States' efforts in Vietnam during this period. They confronted many difficulties. The worst and probably defining struggle of this war was that it was so hard to locate and define the enemy. At times, the enemy was described as communism, or as the Chinese, or as the North Vietnamese, or the Viet Minh, South Vietnamese guerrillas, and each of these involved muddled objectives and how to combat them. And then, of course, there was the literal and physical challenge of just recognizing the enemy in the field of combat. As I mentioned to you, the Viet Minh might be almost described more as a political party. And so it was locating the enemy might be akin to locating a Republican or a Democrat in American society. You're not wearing uniforms and symbols that prove definitively that you are part of one or the other. As the war carried on and deepened, it was also hard to maintain American morale on the home front. This became a protracted war, and the United States and its people were not prepared for such a long engagement. We'll talk much more about this in 1968. American policymakers also struggled with how aggressively to wage the war. Lyndon Johnson was determined not to lose Vietnam. This had been a political death for Harry Truman when he lost China to communism in 1949. But Johnson couldn't wage a total war either, for fear of inspiring Chinese involvement, like what we had seen in Korea, or even sparking World War III with the Soviet Union. Americans also failed to secure political victory, and this is akin to the French and their failures in Vietnam. The ultimate purpose of the war was to establish a secure non communist government in South Vietnam, something to rival Ho Chi Minh and the communists, and they were never able to do this. They also struggled to identify their objective. What was the meaning of victory in this war? It was not the destruction of the enemy, as had been the case in wars in the past. For Westmoreland, victory would mean convincing the enemy that they couldn't prevail and forcing them to quit. Westmoreland at one point said victory meant demonstrating to the Viet Cong that they cannot win. Related to that, there was the problem of using this war as a political ping pong ball and as a political weapon. Escalation or de escalation of the war became a political ploy, as both sides implemented these kind of thoughts about the war in an attempt to win support and win votes on the home front, rather than practically defining what do we need to do in Vietnam itself. And finally, there was the challenge of measuring success or failure in this war. If we struggled to define what the objectives were and what victory meant and what we were trying to achieve, then how did we know if we were actually succeeding in getting there or if we were failing? This war ultimately was not about taking and holding territory, as wars in the past, particularly World War II. The measuring stick came to be a complex formula of body counts, a very problematic process, which we'll talk a little bit more in the next lecture.